So we've been kind of traveling around various topics over the course of the day. And of course, not of course, but we started the morning session looking at a larger scale that was the more urbanistic capacities of housing. And we thought for the last panel that we would sort of kind of bring it inside and spend the next hour and a half or so talking about new domesticities and how urban housing, and particularly new forms of urban housing, can support family and community structures today. And what are the impacts of identity, labor, digital technologies, and changing social structures on domestic environments? This, for those of you getting your continuing education units, is what you will learn. And by the way, I do want to mention, just before I introduce our speakers, we do know that we've had between 30 and 40 folks live streaming throughout each panel. And so I want to just acknowledge them out there as part of our audience. We decided for for this panel in particular to be sure to have more of a kind of international set of speakers who could speak to some of these questions, not just here in the US, but also around the globe. And so I will, without further ado, introduce them. We have Eunice Tseng, who is Associate Professor at the University of Hong Kong and a principal of SKEW Collaborative based in Hong Kong and Shanghai. Ignacio Galan, who is an Assistant Professor at Barnard and at Columbia and principal of IGG Office for Architecture. And Anna Puigdenar, oh, I'm told good, I'm getting there. Associate Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and co-founder of MAIO in Barcelona. They will be followed by a response by Matisse Gross-Kaufmannis, who has joined us this year at Taubman College as our Sanders Fellow, and who I've had the pleasure and will continue to have the pleasure of teaching with in the Systems Studio over the course of this semester. So, Eunice. I want to make sure I don't have yours.
Where's the clicker?
Clicker, just hit the blue, the green.
This?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good afternoon. You can hear me well. All right, this is going to be quite unusual but I believe there are many commonalities. So let me just start by, oops. All right, I'm going to share the cases of Singapore and Hong Kong, specifically on how they grapple with housing extremely high densities to develop what has become the world's largest, two largest public programs. Hong Kong being a public housing program, Hong Kong with 60% public housing, Singapore with almost 85% public housing. So in the late 1950s, a quarter of Singapore's population lived as squatters or in slums, with as many as 200 people living in about 15 by 40 square feet shop house. This was just at the cusp of the new country's public housing program. So it launched its first public housing program in 1960 based on a 5-year program model. On May 30, fast forward to the 70s, in 1976, May 30, 24 international experts signed the declaration of the Vancouver Symposium on the occasion of the Habitat, United Nations Conference on Human Settlements, demanding for government policy to focus on community and environmental planning. Of the 135 country participants, there was an overwhelming presence of representatives from the developing nations. By this time, there were 2 exceptions. In contrast to the images of slums, the two, Singapore and Hong Kong, had begun to take up very different aesthetics beyond that of the typical slum developing nation. Modern public housing was introduced into colonial Singapore through the Singapore Improvement Trust, henceforth I'll call it SIT, established in 1927. It began building its first prototypical housing estate in the periphery of the city center in 1936. However, the housing projects were nowhere close to housing a substantial number of the population. So what happened was immediately after World War II, the colonial SIT expanded its first model housing estate and held its first town planning and housing exhibition in 1948 with Patrick Abercrombie as its guest of honor. Who was Abercrombie? Abercrombie had arrived in Singapore en route Hong Kong, where he was invited as advisor on town planning. He was an English planner and had been doing his rounds as advisor to other British colonial cities such as Colombo, Sri Lanka, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and various parts of India. He would soon be followed by many other experts and specialists sent by the United Nations to Singapore and Hong Kong all through the 1960s and into the 70s. Whereas housing and development were twin instruments undertaken by the same public agency in Singapore, in Hong Kong, however, housing in the late 50s, 60s was still under the jurisdiction of what was called the Resettlement Authority. So the main focus is just on resettlement, very different from Singapore as a starting point. The war and the Chinese Revolution of 1949 saw massive refugees in Hong Kong and Singapore. And on Christmas Day, there was a huge fire in Kowloon, Hong Kong that rendered 53,000 people homeless. Many of them were illegal immigrants. This triggered for Hong Kong the establishment of a resettlement department in 1954, which produced in the following few years what was, what was understood as a kind of, is this a pointer? Okay, so these were in Plan H blocks with the middle of these, the H part, to be communal bathrooms and kitchens. There were precedents for the later public housing estates that were to come. In Singapore, however, at the bottom, the SIT was tackling the fires in a slightly different manner. They were building new blocks and estates very close to the fire sites. Still, this is really not enough for the burgeoning population. So at its demise in 1959, with the exit of the British government, many projects still remain only as blueprints. This ushered in the setting up of the Housing Development Board in 1960 and introduced a citywide housing program which went hand in hand with urban development. With the incumbent nationalist government taking over in 1965, the Housing Development Board, HDB, took up the role of the developer, housing architect, builder, and management agency, and launched its second 5-year program in a bid to win over the citizenry through housing as national stakeholding. Post-war Hong Kong and Singapore shared many common experiences. Right before the colonial government was disbanded in the late 50s, a colony-wide master plan of Singapore was released with the advice of British town planner George Pepler, and who served as advisor after Abercrombie. Despite the fact that Abercrombie had written a report for Hong Kong and not Singapore, no master plan was ever produced for Hong Kong until this day. And due to the lack of political will in Hong Kong, the land rights being held in the hands of a few, the immensity of the refugee situation, and intensifying conflicts between the Chinese and the colonial administration, Hong Kong and Singapore went very different ways from the 90s, which I'll get to shortly. So between 1959 and 63, Singapore had moved from a self-governed city to become a part of Malaya. So during this brief time, it was frequented by United Nations technical assistance experts who advised it on economic, industrial, and urban development. In 1963, a UN technical assistance team, sorry, I'm ahead of myself here, spent 2 months in Singapore studying its various problems to produce a report that it recommended. And the main recommendation was this ring plan in which everything else was organized around a middle catchment area. What was of interest is one of the experts by the name of Otto Königsberger had founded at the AA, the Architects Association in London, a course, a department called tropical architecture. And this had very quickly, as soon as it became a meeting place for various and training ground for students from all over the tropical regions, including Hong Kong, Singapore, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, Central and South America. Amongst the teaching staff were architects Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, as well as others like Jacqueline Tewitt, F.C. Oswald, Aldo Van Eyck, later I.M. Pei, Buckminster Fuller, and even Moshe Safdie. Meanwhile, the two cities continue to be frequented by various experts from the overseas division of the Building Research Station in London. In 1964, on the eve of independence, the HDB announced its plans for a satellite new town on a 600-acre site northeast of the city. That was to be the first fully self-sufficient new town, complete with 35,000 housing units, 16 schools, 4 markets, various light factories, and a 27-acre town center with retail, restaurants, food centers, cinema, and a town park. Unbeknownst to, sorry, I'm always one slide ahead. Apologize, jet lag. Unbeknownst to most, the SIT, so you see that this is the plan by the SIT, this is the plan by the new HDB, which is the National Housing Board. The SIT had already produced a plan for Toa Payoh, but it was shelved like many other plans that it produced in the 50s. So what HDB did was to straighten up all the blocks and to go towards what it's, for the next 30 years after this, a kind of techno-scientific rationality towards housing. In this case, aligning all the blocks north-south in order to minimize tropical heat gain. So compared to the earlier SIT plan, which was considerably, comparatively less efficient, HDB would go towards the efficiency and economic model. Fast forward a few years, for the 1967 World Expo, Singapore News featured this a lot. In particular, it was fascinated with Moshe Safdie's Habitat 67. This was also the first time Safdie came to the attention of the Singapore government, and you will soon see how he is involved in the housing scene in Singapore. So going back to the hills in Toa Payoh, the very first satellite town, were leveled and trucked to a river basin for land reclamation for industrial estate. So it's simultaneous. The building of an industrial estate was simultaneous to the building of a housing estate. HDB tested prefabricated components in the flats and ground floor flats, and ground floor shops. The first phase of Toa Payoh was completed within 2 years, very fast time. In time, they were rushing it for the delegates of the Afro-Asian Housing Congress in October 1967. HDB, led by Australian-trained chief architect, hosted the delegates from 21 nations during the week-long Congress, and after they leave, they begin to sell the newly completed 3-room units through a balloting home ownership scheme for the people. So this was a test case where then they sell it to the citizens. HDB's chief architect presented and lectured extensively on the planning of public housing in Singapore. By 1967, the board had claimed to have housed 25% of the 2 million population. And every time he will remind, at every instance possible, every representative from HDB will remind his audience, both nationally and regionally, that the design and planning of public housing in Singapore is the consequence of a unique geopolitical situation. This is a very important rhetoric that continues till today. So by 1971, the HDB had begun its third 5-year housing program to build 100,000 units, and that equals about 26 one flat unit in every 26 minutes. So we have to do the math, how many a day? Likewise, in Hong Kong, the Housing Authority was just set up about 16 years after the Singapore one. And it also built its first self-contained, low-cost housing estates, much denser. It housed 54,000 people on the western end of the island, very close to the University of Hong Kong. So whereas the question of architecture and national identity was a main preoccupation of the new Singapore government, this was not obviously the case for Hong Kong. Rather, what the two cities shared in common was their enthusiastic reception of the foreign expertise and especially the technological thrust towards economic and urban development. 3 years after Expo 67, SAFDI's prototypical housing exhibition, which the Hong Kongers called Magic Housing Machine, was featured in the South China Morning Post as a model for a new luxury apartment living. This was also discussed, 67 was discussed also in Singapore as an inspired megastructure to accommodate high densities. This was a time when the newly established Urban Renewal Board had recently just sold off large land parcels in the city center, and they were building projects very similar to SAFDI's, at least in section, and advocating for high-density mixed-use housing. In December 71, Buckminster Fuller was invited to Singapore and gave a 2-hour lecture at the university. And this was not his first visit, it was to be his first, but it will be the first of 3 in which he became also very influential ideologically for the young government. The government, the academy, the architectural profession, they love Fuller and SAFDI. They love Fuller because for his intellect, innovation, and visions. So his ideas and publications were publicly discussed and reviewed in the local press throughout the 70s, well into the 80s. Fuller's ideas appealed especially to the mainstream government and its critics, to the extent that it was even brought up at a parliamentary debate when the founder of the Democratic Party outwardly criticized what was becoming cultural protectionism in the leadership, practicing intellectual elitism, and so he quoted Bucky Fuller to emphasize that we should really focus on the majority and not the minority literate. I think it was a bit of a misquote, but still. So I think Fuller in general was very misquoted in Singapore. But while Fuller's ideas on harnessing technology and synergetic thinking were very appealing across the board to governments, NGOs, technocrats, even activists, he somehow remained mainly as an invocative figure rather than rather than an informative one. His ideas and those in Habitat 76 did not actually inform the production and processes of housing in Singapore. By this time, the housing program was really in full force in Singapore and Hong Kong. Singapore took the lead in prefabrication techniques. Hong Kong took the lead in high-rise, high-density construction. Singapore's HDB at that time was facing rising construction costs and a shortage of skilled labor. And so what did it do? It began to study this and set up its internal research facility, bought over a factory, and began to then become its own builder. It set up its own industrialized method of construction so that it can beat the sort of market. And it started at the same time looking for international expertise to assist in its prefabricating building efforts. So by this time, HDB was both researcher, fabricator, builder, developer. Public housing in Singapore and Hong Kong was speeding neck to neck in the 70s, especially in the building of new towns. Hong Kong introduced a 10-year program, and that was launched in 75. As you can see here, this was the first one. And high-rise become no longer a contest. High-rise building became a de facto or default, and it was the main emphasis in every area of the industry, undertaken by public and private enterprises, from research to construction. At the same time, the university was, I would say, co-opted, or very much part of this discourse, and all of the housing authorities' flats in Hong Kong were built by Hong Kong U graduates in the 70s. I happened to interview a few of them today, and they claimed that they were really testing various typologies at this time. In contrast to Singapore, where research, development, and construction were undertaken by the HDB, however, there was a shift in Hong Kong where the private sector began to be much more involved in the high-density, high-rise community building conversation. So this was most intensively and visibly demonstrated in this project. It's ridiculously huge. It was developed by Mobil Oil Company and designed, of course, by Hong Kong U graduates. 99 towers in a private housing complex. It took 10 years to build, built in 8 stages from 1968 to 78, and accommodated 80,000 people in 13,500 units. Hong Kong and Singapore by this time was acknowledged by the United Nations as really exemplary but not models, mainly because the larger question of the developing nations was, according to the United Nations, cannot be applicable by looking at these two as models because of the direction they went. For the other parts and the other developing nations, the rural and the countryside is still the predominant question. So having been identified as an exception, where was Singapore going? At habitat, because what does it, so what was the direction it was offering to the habitat question in 76? What it did then was to offer its first new town as the exhibition town for the delegates of the conference to come visit after the conference, and they would do tours around the entire town as an exhibit. Meanwhile, Hong Kong was praised throughout the 70s for its work by its new housing authority. And so private housing, and these is all private housing. Private housing and public housing were going neck to neck by the 70s. But by the end of the decade, Singapore was already building up its presence in the United Nations and increasing its engagement in international conversations on cities and urban development. Hong Kong, however, not quite a nation state, was witnessing the burgeoning of the private housing market fueled by property speculation that would define the architecture of the city henceforth. And I'm happy to talk about that maybe later in conversation about how it is affecting also what's happening to Hong Kong today. The laissez-faire colonial government in Hong Kong by the 70s was already cautious of arousing further anti-colonial sentiments. So it really let the economy loose in that sense. Instead of embarking on a big housing project, it focused on infrastructural building, like bridges and tunnels and so on. It was in Singapore then that SAFDI 67 and the United Nations 76, vis-a-vis Fuller and the technical experts before him, was reconstituted and consolidated into a single architectural entity for housing. And I've not been looking at the time, so I'm going to go quick. touted as Habitat to, oh, sorry. So Habitat became, Safdie was invited to present Habitat in Singapore, and this was the very first one. And then subsequent Habitat 2 was also kind of presented. And then the other Habitat was also then built and presented in the 80s. And subsequently, he was not only invited to design Habitat in Singapore, but also to advise on what is actually Habitat. And this was a project that Safdie served as a consultant and won a United Nations Habitat Award. So, but however, by the early 2000s, HDB wanted to break its own mold to utilitarian housing. So it launched its first public housing competition internationally. There were over 200 international entries, and this was the winning scheme by a young graduate couple who designed this 6 blocks of 50-story high exhibition housing with 2 parks and jogging tracks above. What you don't see here, it's a very intense landscape parking and park, which is where all the communal activities are housed. And this was to launch the nation's new direction for public housing, which is that there is no limit to public housing design. So Safdie went on to then participate in private housing. This was 2015, and this was Habitat in the ramped up version of 67 called Sky Habitat, and higher, 3 times denser than the first Habitat he proposed in 1967. His idea was to continue the streets in the air with all these houses stacked up in the 3-dimensional matrix of homes. The final slides, I'm going to basically situate what happened when there's too much political will. So in his, I don't know how else to say that, but in his 2000 speech, the original prime minister, then the minister mentor, he announced this new scheme called the ROH. This was the design built, which is a demand built on demand, and this was called the ROH, which is called Remaking Our Heartland. The idea behind this was to systematically propose integrated schemes that are master planned with 5 to 10 years, looking towards 2030. To develop a scheme that is housing but integrated with all green infrastructure. So the most ambitious of this was an eco-town that was developed around a waterway. So it's completely worked on new water infrastructure. And another was to develop a play corridor where they renovated every old structure, so existing structure, or introduced new structure for different kinds of leisure. Meanwhile, even though many architects did not make it to win the Pinnacle competition, however, those who made it to the short list were invited back by the Housing Board to develop new ROH projects. So examples are these by the country's most famous architects called Woha, who developed these versions that were essentially iterations of their shortlisted schemes for the Pinnacle. And all these projects and more dovetailed into the 2030 master plan that was to envision more land, more home, more green. So I'm kind of going to end with Fuller again, which is a kind of mantra that still exists today, that the idea really in housing in Singapore, I would say, is the reforming of the environment. And with that, they believe that then the people will be reformed too. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a great day. So I'm going to take the prompt of the panel quite directly. So I'm going to talk about domesticity as the social networks shaped by housing. My now in the title, domesticity is now, is going to be very broad. So I'm going to talk about more than a century kind of questions in this short presentation that I'm going to organize in 3 little episodes that are kind of projects that I've developed to pursue this fundamental question to housing, which is, who is my neighbor? And throughout these 3 episodes, I'll shift from historian to designer, in a way mediating between Eunice and Anna's talks, and in that way maybe I'm facilitating the conversation. So first episode, Diasporic Communities. The question, who is my neighbor, appears in an 1898 article authored by photographer and housing activist Jacob Riis. And he posted in his analysis of the ways in which Italians lived together in New York City at the turn of the century. His article documented the relationship between the internal diversity of Italians in New York City and their distributions throughout Little Italy. And according to him, Italians of different regions gathered in the same streets in order to support each other, and this was made visible through their different saint patrons that they celebrated. And I quote from that article, as San Roque, an important saint in Calabria in the south of Italy, rules Mulberry Street, so Thompson Street is preempted by St. Anthony of Padua. End quote. Religious performances and communities of neighborliness and support were many times consolidated around regional demarcations in different streets. But other times, these religious performances challenged regional divisions and shaped larger social articulations. Particularly important was the case of the Lady of Mount Carmel, which defied the atomization of the Italian population along different regions. In fact, these performances around the Lady of Mount Carmel increasingly went from reinforcing regional enclaves and their associated identities to perform a form of belonging to a larger community of national reach, even while away from that very nation, and while gathered around a virgin that had no relevance in Italy. And that I found interesting. So I start with these notes because, as you well know, Jacob Riis is one of the fundamental figures documenting the architectures of housing in New York City at the turn of the century, which I've been studying in relation to the different diasporic communities settling in the city at the time. And I'm interested in diasporic communities as part of a larger consideration of the ways in which architecture mediates new forms of being together characteristic of a life in transit, like the ones that these religious performances manifest. The diasporic migration that followed the Italian unification found, in fact, in New York, one of its preferred destinations. And interestingly, this dispersion coincided with the rise of Italian nationalism, a pursuit to define the nation which was discussed at the time in those terms that you see there as the need to create Italians. And inclusions and exclusions to that community of Italians were also performed in New York. In fact, as you can read there, Italian migrants in the city were considered to be not Italians because they've never been Italians. That's the way in which the manager of the Casa Italiana, Giuseppe Prezzolini, put it at the time. And at play, as you can see in his arguments, was the rejection of Southern populations in the construction of Italian model citizens and their simultaneous rejection in New York, which became at the time the 4th largest city in number of Italians. And regardless of the legal definition of Italian citizenship, it is the possibility to produce citizens, we have to create Italians, and to produce non-citizens, they are not Italians, which is made evident in this sequence of arguments. And it is the one that I'm suggesting to study in relation to certain transformations of housing at the turn of the century, that is to look at housing in relation to different diasporic communities settling in the city. Jacob Riis provided an exceptional chronicle for those transformations, and his famous concern for the ways in which the other half lives situated these conversations in relation to the diasporic communities settling in the city, dedicating one chapter of his book to each of these communities. And I'm interested in the way in which Riis's response to the tenements as a housing activist addressed their spatio-technical problems, the ones we know, lack of ventilation, lack of space, but was also guided by a pursuit for the normalization of the populations that lived within them, particularly committed to shaping the nuclear family as a privileged social formation in America. By far, he argued, the largest part of crimes in the city are perpetrated by individuals whose homes have ceased to be sufficiently separate to afford the influences of home and family. So his project was not only to address the problem of ventilation, as I'm saying, but also the need of shaping Italians as part of this model of living together, which was the nuclear family. In response to these arguments, I'm interested in the ways in which the tenements and the expanded households that Riis criticized, that is, those aggregations that challenge the nuclear family that he pursued to save, facilitated alternative networks of support for Italians in response to their virtual lack of citizenship. And I'm interested here in some arguments by historians that have been saying that with the expanding length of these corridors, some of the rooms started to open directly to these corridors and facilitated the incorporation of borders and people that were arriving to the city at that moment into these very households. In fact, most of the times, people that were friends of those families coming from their regions of origin and created networks of support among them, thus the religious performances that were gathered around the same regions, because the same regions were, the people from the same region were living together in these tenements. So I'm interested in the possibility of analyzing different housing types at the time in relation to the different types of communities that they aim to shape and their different projects for the diasporic communities settling in the city at the time. And while I'm considering these questions historically, I'm also interested in the possibility of creating new architecture supporting social formations that could challenge the frameworks linking citizenship with the family and the nation. So these questions concern the relation between the architectures of residence, both physical and legal residence, i.e. the nation, and it's grounded on a broader concern of mine with processes of dissolution and disembedding of social relations on the one hand, and the search for different forms of binding and belonging on the other. And I'm interested not in a commercialized version of belonging like the one promoted by Airbnb here, but rather in its manifestation as a contentious affiliation, one that is being defined by what different theorists have considered as the disjunctures or the displacements or frictions of the contemporary world, which are increasingly relevant to address the architectures of housing today and the modes of being together or finding who is my neighbor. So working with the After Belonging Agency, I developed a research project that considered some examples of housing in Northern Europe, including examples like this, in which the realm of ownership and identity are negotiated within diversity. This is an apartment that is part of a massive program with which the Swedish government set itself to build 1 million residences between 1965 and 1974, aiming to alleviate the housing shortage of the cities in the post-war. The population of working-class families, that was the original target of the program, currently includes more than 85% of migrants and hosts an increasingly translocal community. The question, who is my neighbor, is particularly relevant in this context. And the homogenized landscape of modernist blocks surrounded by greenery and the standardized designs of 2 to 3 bedroom apartments that were aiming to host the typical Swedish family now host a diversity of occupations, and the late modernist facades is now punctuated by a plantation of satellite antennas which enrich the local scene with remote sounds and images that build a new global domestic landscape. In this project, we were also interested in architectures specifically purposed for the reception and transit of immigrants and refugees, which have arrived in large numbers to Northern Europe in the last years. Asylum seeker centers like this one in Oslo have the capacity for hundreds of individuals and host both kids as well as single adults and families. And despite the transitory character of these centers, some individuals have stayed in these for up to 5 years as they await the processing of their asylum applications. Their shifting population is an index of current international conflicts and replicates them in the few square meters in which these communities coexist in the centers, where citizens of opposing factions translate their territorial, political, religious, or cultural struggles to the center's common spaces. In the most banal cases, those manifest in who takes over control of music broadcasting in those spaces or internet bandwidth, but in others they reach other scales. Regulations for the asylum seeker centers in Norway is entangled within a larger legal mandate to provide shelter to all its inhabitants. And this shelter is defined by law as sparse but safe, and those are the terms that the law uses. And while these facilities could be operated by NGOs, most of them are currently run by private commercial agents who translate the sparseness of this definition into material economies tied to the fluctuations of the market and link the right to housing with the logics of profit. And these were some of the examples that we used to help frame the curatorial framework of the Oslo Triennale 2016, with which our goal was to craft a platform for the collective inspection of the ways in which architecture participates in the definition of our attachment to placements and to places and collectivities, and with the objects we own, share, and exchange. And we called it After Belonging, not to define a posterior condition, how is housing now that we don't belong, but rather to invite a mode of speculation after belonging, indicating a pursuit, the pursuit for new forms of being together, responding to a life in transit. And I wanted to end with a project in which this concern with housing in a time defined by mobility and transit was developed in response to a call for proposals by the IBA. And this is a project that I developed with the Open Workshop. The call asked to reconcile industrial facilities with housing in the suburban neighborhood of Wilhelmsburg in Hamburg, Germany. Different to the association of the suburbs with single-family home ownership prevalent in the US, this neighborhood mixes industrial facilities with populations lacking stability, including migrants and young people, and is currently hosting also a large number of refugees, of those that, as I mentioned, are arriving to Northern Europe, in part due to this large arrival of migrants to locations similar to Wilhelmsburg. The notion of residence has become a contentious concept and a disputed context in Germany and in other European locations. The term Heimat, meaning both home and homeland, has channeled many of the political discussions in Germany, and according to a local journalist, in the recent regional elections last fall, every party allegedly claimed the term Heimat for themselves, including the far-right party that got very good results. But I'm also interested in scenes like this taking place in this very neighborhood, where Javad Samperur, an Iranian refugee, is being hosted by an aging family to which he provides care. And our project speculates on architecture's capacity to grant different populations with recognition, those different populations inhabiting the neighborhood, without equating recognition with property, and aims to facilitate networks of support among these populations. In order to facilitate these networks, the project considers a series of spatial relations and forms of collective management, supporting different types of co-housing and work cooperatives. And the project proposes a key typological operation combining the housing perimeter block for these three blocks, together with the black box architecture for the industrial spaces in the center. In addition to the different spatial configurations, we also define a clear set of protocols for the negotiations that would necessarily take place with the different agents during the development period. A series of circuits, here in red, you can see them both here and in the images, tie the different programs together with uses that would be collectively defined within the previously established frameworks that I defined before. And with these strategies, the project considers architecture's participation in the provision of individuals with recognition, but also in this project of triggering diverse forms of encounter among diversity, and facilitates different networks of support among the inhabitants of the project. And while I aim to explore the relation between architecture and diverse social forms, I'm also wary of attempts to establish deterministic relations between the forms of architecture and the forms of society. And yet, I'm interested in the ways in which spatial relations articulated with different management systems might trigger material links, affinities, and collaborations that are behind those new forms of being together that I'm trying to define. The hope is that belonging in this housing project would not be based on common identities or an asserted saint patron, but could rather relate to what Paolo Virno described as belonging as such, as different from belonging to. Belonging as such, in his mind, are new forms of association that might not be predicated on shared essences or property relations. So, bridging from historical analysis to design, the goal of these projects is to expose the challenges that housing faces in today's increasingly transient world, as we explore the critical question that concerned Jacob Riis already in the 19th century: who is my neighbor? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be part of this panel with such nice colleagues. And so first of all, thank you, Sharon, for organizing this and inviting me to be part of this symposium. I'm part of Mayo. It's an architectural office based in Barcelona that started in 2012. But the idea of the space was initiated in 2011 in the midst of this momentum in Spain, where all our public space were occupied with a lot of strikes, social manifestations, etc. Because, as you might know, we were deep into a crisis that we are still in. It is an economical crisis, but it's mainly a social crisis. So as a result, with a group of friends, not only we needed to reduce our expenses, but also we were willing to be together just to discuss. And we took over a space in Barcelona, and we refurbished it to turn it into our working space. We opened a patio in the middle, defining a front area that is always empty and open to the public, where we host our talks, etc. And in the rear area, This is the front area. In the rear area is defined by this 12.5 meters long table. It's a really long table where we all gather. We're people from different disciplines. Let's say that at the beginning, we thought that this was actually going to be a temporary thing, so a place that we were temporarily sharing with colleagues. But through time, it not only became a place to work, it defined the way we understood our own practices. We are from many disciplines, from architecture, landscaping, construction, engineering, design, graphic design, etc. And at the end, as I was saying, the table started to influence the way we understand, in our case, architecture. So since then, we talked that our practice, basically, we define formats, instructions of use, that sometimes are materialized in a piece of paper, or sometimes are materialized, so let's say, place a 12-meter long table in a space and see what happens, or sometimes are physically materialized as such. Soon after opening the space, we won a competition to design a public space in Barcelona. At the time, we had a lot of empty lots that couldn't be built. And in order to avoid decay, the city council decided to invest, to provide little budgets, pockets of money, to develop what they call an ephemeral urban space. In our case, this intervention had to last 10 years. As you know, we have a deep tradition of public participation. So we started our process of public participation, working actively with different associations. And what happened actually is that, as you may imagine, as I was at the time, we were all really mad with our politicians. So the consequence of the public participation was a permanent disagreement. And that permanent disagreement ended up being transformed with a huge list of wishes that, of course, with our super little budget, we couldn't fulfill. And it ended up with the politicians saying, look, we cannot say anything in front of this situation, so you architects solve this. So as a consequence, what we did was the only thing that we could do was to provide the minimum infrastructure with our little pocket in order to allow all those uses to be during the time in the future, when actually those agreements could be established. So in Barcelona, public space needs to be lightened. Otherwise, it needs to be fenced, and it has a lot of economical consequences. So basically what we did was to define a grid of lighting poles that we knew that that grid of lighting poles could host in the future all those wishes that the neighbors wanted. The consequence of this lead of lighting poles and nothing else was quite radical, because we were on the front page in some newspapers as the worst public space ever in Barcelona. And of course, as being our first project, you can imagine it hurt our ego a little bit. But what happened, it was quite interesting that thanks to that publicity, suddenly, and thanks to that, let's say, discontent from the neighbors, that of course they wanted more, we started a real public participation. We set up a set of instructions of anything that could happen legally. Of course, as technicians, we have a certain knowledge that can be of help, so we set that in a booklet that we provide to the neighbors, and through time, we start developing all those wishes bit by bit based on a real process of consensus and dissent. And if you go there nowadays, that's after a year of working with them. After a year, they stop inviting us, and they keep on going. And nowadays, the square has radically changed, and it's going to keep on changing. And with that, we learn a lot of things. First, we learn the value of time. The value to understand designs that are able to allow things to happen and change through time, as our table. And we also value the idea of the unfinished. What we learn also is that we are too used to ask for things in public space, and that has produced a detachment from our public space. So basically we call the police when something happens and the city council when somebody is not picking up the garbage properly, instead of taking care of that public space. So to have spaces that are in permanent change and demand caring allow us to raise the awareness and basically allow us to boost a real appropriation of that public space. So it's true, it's still really ugly, but it is extremely active and it works really well socially for the neighborhood. I wanted to start with this first project because it's really influenced our way of working, and we have done a lot of housing, but you will see that despite it's a different totally scale, scope, etc., it has something in common. So we won a competition, a private competition for a private developer to build a collective house in Barcelona. We are in the Eixample, in this neighborhood that defined the city in the 19th century based on this grid of eternal growth that we all really admire. And what we really admire of this urban form is that despite the order and the repetition of this block, all the disorder and all the heterogeneity can happen within. And what we also admire a lot is that despite it's more than 100 years old neighborhood, it hasn't changed that much, its physicality, and that's because its typology. So the typology that defined this neighborhood in the 19th century is based on a floor plan that has semi-equal rooms, so they're not exactly equal, but and that has helped to that the neighborhood has changed from being a housing neighborhood to an office neighborhood, and nowadays is coming back to housing again without radical changes. So the idea of having these generic rooms that any kind of use can happen, we thought and we considered that was of a hate value. So we wanted to take that idea back, defining a room that could host any use, and in our case, any domestic program. So the domestic program at the end is defined by the inhabitants, by the users, but not by us. And that somehow we had on the table this art piece. It's an art book from Nicola Rourke called Spook Story without characters, that basically what the artist did was to erase all the main characters of this Donald Duck comic. So there's no the duck, there's no other figures, and he also erased the text. So at the end, what happened is that everything that is on the back, it's brought on the front, and some sort of abstraction emerges. So suddenly, all stories can happen within the same framework. So we start, at the time, we start thinking, how could we do the same with our houses? How to define a housing typology that can host any kind of story? Why we were so obsessed with that idea, you have to imagine a social crisis plus an economical crisis, where apart from that people was being kicked out from homes, et cetera, what happened is that there was a lot of mobility. Elderly coming back to their sons' houses, young ones coming back to their parents' houses, et cetera. And suddenly those social changes allow us to understand that our housing typologies, the ones that we had and we were promoting, both from the private and from the public sector, were not able to embrace that diversity, because most of it is defined by a prototypical floor plan defined by a large living room with a large bedroom with a private bathroom, plus two smaller rooms. And actually that typology is just defined by one social structure type, that is our prototypical so-called family, defined by 1, 2 parents, 1, 2 kids. Meanwhile, we realized that at the time, of course, our society was shaking, but also our society at that time was defined, so less than the 30% of our society could be defined under that definition. So what happens with the other 70 large percent that doesn't fit in this perfect glove? So we were kind of claiming to bring a new typology that could actually embrace all kind of social structures and also could embrace future social changes without the need of changing radically. So the result was this set of apartments defined by semi-equal rooms. So the domestic program is not predetermined. Even the kitchen can be placed in any room thanks to the position of the bathrooms where all electric supply, AC, water supply, and drainage run. So we also, you have to imagine that the typology, I think that it was a bit, like, it attracted a little bit of attention basically because it was really difficult to do this following the law. So our law, of course, laws are there to protect us, and our law end up defining, pushing us to define and to promote just that apartment type based on the family, the prototypical family. So through time, we have learned that, of course, laws are important, and laws are really important to shape the way we live. At the end, they do have a lot of influence. But our society changes faster than the laws can change. So us as architects, our role is to be able to find those loopholes that in the meantime the law is changed, we're able already to operate and be critical with our typologies and push them further. So there's a lot of loopholes here. That's why we could achieve it. And one of the loopholes is a door. I'm not going to go that much into it, maybe later in the conversation. In the ground floor, as in a different manner, what we did was, again, to do a reenactment of the tradition of the neighborhood, where halls were defined by marbles as to raise the symbol of the collective. So usually the most expensive and valued material was always placed there. And we opened the patio to the exterior in a way that it rains inside in the hall to blur the limits between the outside and the inside, between the public, the urban space and indoors, but also to allow this air that runs on the patios to have a better humidity and therefore a better ventilation for the houses. And with the facade, we just did, again, a reenactment of a traditional way of composing the facades to the point that people think, actually, that we just refurbished an old building, and we're so proud of that because it means that it fits on place, it fits there properly. And nowadays, I'm going to go really fast, but basically, we have invited to keep on and push that typology further in the social sector, or in the public sector for social housing. So that's a building that hopefully it will be built next year for Infonavit, the government of Mexico. That's a building that is going to break the ground really soon in Barcelona for the municipality of the city for social housing. But then let me go back to the typology. So we call this building 110 rooms, basically because those rooms, those generic rooms, the lack of program, also are displaced in a way that allow the apartments to expand and decrease. And again, it was a kind of a critique or a reflection about how we were producing housing. If we are aware that our needs in a lifetime change a lot, not only our economical capacity, but also our spatial need, how come our houses cannot adapt to our needs in terms of a space? So we were kind of proposing that our typologies should be able to answer to that spatial change demand based on its organization. And this idea of expanding and decreasing the apartments actually comes from a research that I've been doing for years about kitchenless houses in the 19th century New York that emerged after the Civil War. 1971 was the first one, and the typology started to decay after the crash, after 2009 1929. And apart from lacking of kitchens and having a lot of collective services, of course, collective kitchens, one of the values of that kitchenless typology was actually that the apartments could expand and decrease depending on the demand. I know that I'm late. How many minutes? 1 minute, okay. So just to frame it, this is a PhD. It's gonna come out as a book soon, stay tuned. And I just collect a lot of cases like that one, kitchenless houses for middle class. I'm not gonna go too much into it. But I wanted to frame it, I wanted at least to bring here today the research, because in the office, in parallel, we always research. And we use research in an active manner. So whatever we research, we know that it's going to have an impact in our practice. And after the kitchenless story, I started researching about collective cooking, contemporary practice worldwide. Thanks to Harvard, I got a grant to travel the world and visit many cases during 2 years. Basically, I was visiting collective kitchens that operate as urban infrastructures, and they were able to reshape pre-existing social, labor, and gender structures. So that's an image of Peru, of Lima. I've been in Canada, China, Senegal. I'm not going to go Singapore, of course, for the elderly. Really good projects. Mexico, Japan, and all, as I was mentioning, for me, the interest is to understand what happens when an essential element of our home, of what we consider our home, that is the kitchen, is detached from the home itself and it's shared, which are the political, economical, and social consequences. So I guess that this research would have an impact on the practice soon, or it's already having it. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. Hopefully, we're gonna do some kind of collective. Should we do a collective thing, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's better. Let's not to make it too. Yeah. Oh, please. Right. Okay. So I'm gonna do a quick response here. Thanks Eunice, Ignacio, and Anna for 3 really different but incredible talks going through the last 100 years and more of domesticity and housing in different forms. So new domesticities. I'm not trained in history and I come from practice, so I will really focus on the now times. And I will try to also look at your work from this perspective. So in general, as many speakers have indicated in this symposium today and probably yesterday as well, in our work as architects, planners, developers, and activists in housing, there's certainly an appetite for newness, both in Detroit and elsewhere. And newness not only in terms of new opportunities for real estate development, new policies or planning strategies, but also new unit typologies, new ways of granting affordability, new ideas for parking, and also new understandings of what a home could be and who could build it, who could inhabit, and in which way. And in that sense, I think the last 3 presentations that we just saw, in a way, offer some kind of way of addressing and imagining newness in housing, and thinking in ways beyond the general imagination of, let's say, practice that we see in most places. Thinking how can we address newness in housing in terms of who should design, build, and develop housing, what program housing should offer, but also what are the kind of programmatic ingredients that actually constitute a home today. So just to quickly recap, so we had this fascinating journey telling this whole story of development of Singapore's world-famous housing development board, and in parallel what happened in Hong Kong, which I think is fascinating mainly well, in many parts in the global north and probably elsewhere as well, to see how kind of effectively an absolute monopoly, government-driven monopoly of designing, allocating, researching, producing and constructing housing can actually bring great results in terms of, at least on the statistical scale. We can talk later about the quality of some of those developments. But I think it's quite impressive that to have any place in the world where 80% of housing is effectively produced by public sector. And here I exclude the Soviet Union, of course. So at the same time, we also saw 3 projects, kind of fast forward, look at, let's say, I guess living together and living apart in a way, in different conditions. And in a way how kind of residents can be seen both as the national way of belonging, but also a way of kind of, domesticity. And in a way how architecture can produce environments for new forms of togetherness, hopefully. And I think we saw a few different examples to answer the question, who is my neighbor and who could be my neighbor in the future. And finally, we also show a range of approaches in research, but also design work, how to rethink our relationship to home and household, and also what are, let's say, the kind of technologies and practices that are needed to maintain the daily life at home, and let's say also, how could we think about it in alternative terms? And while one might wonder about, let's say, the relationship to the market economy and further commodification of our daily routines, I feel that in Anna's study, we see that it illustrates with the last examples of collective kitchens that going kitchenless can actually be an act of collective care instead of some kind of mere business opportunity. And there are other ways of organizing life at home than some kind of extraction of surplus value from someone else's labor. So, in relation to all of those different layers that we have looked at, I would just like to add one more layer, and then we can go through discussion. So I'm wondering how could we think, and also thinking about what we saw earlier today, how can we think of new actors and new combinations of different actors in housing production, and how, more importantly, how could we think of new domesticities that benefit not only certain communities, collectives, or individuals, but also contribute to broader efforts of reorganizing our society, our resource allocation, our supply chains, and also, ultimately, our environmental footprint of our daily lives. So, as we keep, nowadays, as we keep recycling our domestic waste and purchase local organic produce, the glaciers keep melting, and microplastics keep finding a way into our water supply. And in a way, also looking at, let's say, national borders, we know that they are really a poor remedy against the effects of climate change. And I would like to draw a parallel here to individual home, because obviously, while on one hand, home seems to indicate some kind of autonomy and refuge from the world, at the same time, inevitably, it is connected to broader life support systems and frameworks, be it urban, infrastructural, but also social, political, economic. And in a way, whatever transforms in our domestic realms has kind of cumulative effects on the society at large, which I think is a very important way to think about housing. So when we talk about new domesticities, new ways of articulating belonging, new forms of collectivities in housing, I wonder how we can also think of collectivity in terms of responsibility and in terms of care that reaches beyond the kind of delineated borders of our immediate homes, beyond our front door, our property lines, our collective kitchens, and our community rooms of the sharing economy. And then how can we design these new domesticities and find the best weapons or the best tools in our arsenal as architects, planners, developers that really make it happen. So for instance, just to give you a few examples, if we reassemble the household and eliminate the kitchen, what does it do to food supply chains and this whole ecosystem of containers and packaging? Likewise, if we envision new spatial and legal forms of residence, what does it do to our obsession with private property and the willingness to exercise our property rights? And ultimately, also, if we design some kind of total political and financial megastructures of housing provision for every citizen and non-citizen, how can we, or how does this reform our relationship to collective identity and broader collective awareness? So I have a few more specific questions to each of you, but before we do that, I think it's good to ask, is there any burning question in the audience, either from the audience here or from the audience here in spirit online? Yes or no? Right. No? Yes, no? Right. 10-second break.
There's a question.
Right. How does it work? I never used this before. Okay.
I can try.
If there's one burning question, I think it's good just to already start. Yeah.
Wait.
I like to cook. And then the other thing is that how much change can you make through subverting? If you take the idea of the kitchen, what is it? The thing that defines a single family house is actually the number of kitchens. If you attach buildings and there's no separation between one piece of the building and the next, the only definition is one kitchen. You can actually do a bar, like you can stick that in. So you could have a completely different living structure in single-family house zones if collective households are made. So it's like that. So rather than getting rid of the kitchen, I think make use of it as a good system.
No, definitely. Like kitchenless living is the research that I've been doing. Basically, is a provocation to start a conversation. It's a provocation to start a conversation and to raise the awareness of the lack of diversity in terms of that. So I would answer with the same question: what happens actually if I don't want a kitchen?
Yeah.
So so it's basically to be aware that we don't have that much diversity in typologies. Actually, it was claimed this morning, and I totally agree. And what happens is about sharing, it's always the first thing that we have to be sure is that we want to share. So if a collective wants to share, then whatever you share, it's going to work.
Yeah.
So, and then there's all kinds of collective kitchens, from those that really erase the kitchens from each apartment to those that act as, sorry, it's me. To those that act really as a complement to a smaller kitchen. And again, yeah, the law, for instance, in Spain forces us to build kitchens, but let's analyze what defines a kitchen nowadays.
Good question.
Or family.
Maybe I could follow up immediately, since we're talking about kitchens. I like kitchens, but I also understand that it's easy to do without. So I was wondering, I mean, if you look nowadays, there are all kinds of efforts more for the marketplace to eliminate certain parts of the home, right? To make it smaller, to make living room as part of some kind of shared community, to eliminate kitchen for different reasons. And of course, on one hand, we can see that it's a way to build community, to foster new relationships. At the same time, it also can be seen as some kind of way of reallocation of resources, you know, as some kind of late neoliberal optimization, how we can cut down more things and maybe also bring more work to the home and do all these other transformations. So in context of your whole thesis of kitchenless city and idea of how we could eliminate the kitchen, I'm wondering if, let's say, if you remove the kitchen from the equation of a house or a home, you know, it's not said that we need to eliminate that space at all. And you also show some examples of indeterminate spaces and different things that could happen in them. So I'm wondering, maybe we could speculate here. What could be the thing that is left behind? Could we think of some new uses or new things emerging in place of kitchen as a kind of domestic spiritual ingredient? You know, for instance, can we think of home as a site for different kind of engagement life that is free from domestic labor, but at the same time is meant really to be a place of tranquility and joy, and maybe some kind of new programmatic ingredients could allow that?
But I would just to follow up a little bit the thought that you were having. Collective kitchens not only foster communities, and of course not only also are a real estate tool, nowadays really successful in certain types of dense cities, especially in New York and similar cities that which density and type and real estate type allow these companies to make a lot of profit based on that typology. But for me, what is really meaningful about those kitchens is actually that they reshape labor structures. Yeah. And it's about caring and what it's the so-called labor of love, as Silvia Federici named it in the 70s, that is still a topic that we are not addressing. So, of course, they foster community, but a lot of things foster community. But kitchens, where are we taking care of when we're talking about, when it's about domestic labor and social bias and et cetera, dependency. So I think that that's, for me, the most interesting thing to talk, because suddenly in those collective kitchens, all those things are spoken. Who pays for what? Who receives the money for what? Who cooks and who cleans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly you realize that in that collectivity you have a mirror of our society, of a lot of things that have been structured as such, preset, and not necessarily work well for all our social structures.
Right.
If I can add two things to that, I think that something that is quite important to that, like in that research and more broadly in innovations in new forms of domesticity, is the fact that what you are doing, I feel, is acknowledging forms of living together that already exist and that might be disjointed with the architectural realities that we've been producing, and like kind of acknowledging those realities and providing frameworks in which they can thrive, rather than in the kind of provocation that you put at the end, like trying to invent new societies, but rather acknowledging that those societies are already happening and providing frameworks that allow them to thrive, I think is very important. And second, to your point about the neoliberal co-option of sharing and such, that's why I think that trusting typologies alone is not necessarily helpful, that it's important to always look simultaneously at spatial relations and new typologies, but also systems of collective management, legal frameworks and such that make those operate in certain ways, their economic models and such. So I think that in your historical research, you barely mentioned it today, but you, like in previous conversations we've had, you've gone through those beautiful floor plans of New York apartment buildings, but also through the legal frameworks and systems of collective management that allow those to thrive and then to decay with the big crash of 1929. So I think that as architects to become more and more accustomed to not trust types or necessarily only spatial relations to facilitate those domestic models, but also work as you did in the Square project through the frameworks that allow certain things to happen and others not, is the way in which we are going to have to be working if we want to embrace certain positive aspects of these forms of sharing while responding to the we live and all these commercialized versions, because I think that it would be a pity to say, well, sharing now belongs to we work and we live and all this, and we are not going to let thrive, we are not going to provide like with recognition to these forms of being together that are happening. We are not as architects to invent those social models or community forms, but rather acknowledge them, and by like those that acknowledgement is very important, like to give those forms of living together with recognition, to surface those populations that might be living in forms of coexistence that might not be acknowledged by the single family home that is prevalent.
So, yeah.
I'm going to have to chime in. When you actually have to operate in a context where, to pick up on my last provocation, where essentially the architect, the government, everyone has to be highly reflexive because everything is very volatile all the time. It's a very developing context, even though they're not developing cities anymore. Then the question of the task of the architect become very interesting, I say, and that is where I was deciding whether to do a 20-minute talk on the kind of work I was doing as an architect, or should I actually be sharing the context that required me to have to do the kind of work I described. So I can talk about it, which is what happened when, say, and I want to chime in on the kitchen later also, but what happened when 85% of the work is all done by the state? Then there's a lot of architects produce every year, what do we do? And so one of the many things we do in the end is things that go beyond the conventions of what a designer do, including advising, for example, serving as consultants to different parts in the region, which possibly explain why my practice is in China. And also then back there to actually, and we have a whole bunch of projects on single family dwelling actually, that were the 12–15% of what's not shown that most architects were operating in. At the same time, as an educator, the people that we teach, many of them are designing the public housing that were kind of being there, so participating in and educating on what is public space become very much part of the job also of the architect educator. And so on that note, I want to segue into the kitchen conversation, because one of the things that is especially interesting in observing and studying historically in Singapore and Hong Kong is the question of the kitchen was already long past. Like, nobody needs a kitchen, it's just too expensive to have a kitchen. And so, and also because it's very cheap to eat everywhere else outside of your own apartment, why do you need a kitchen? And so that, so then what does the architect do? Actually, what do we design now that there's no kitchen? Before we jump into that conversation, we actually have to pull back, because rather than just saying, well, since we don't need a kitchen, let's forget about designing kitchen. What I've been doing with my students is actually to observe situations like this. And what has happened over the years is that there are other kinds of kitchens that have emerged, because there are still some people who love cooking. And so they are called private kitchens. And in Hong Kong, for example, there's a lot of private kitchens that are word of mouth. People who love to cook open up spontaneously private kitchens, and people who don't like to cook but do not want to go to a restaurant but want to go to a kitchen because they want a domestic setting. And so there's a very interesting ecology. At the same time, there's also another phenomenon that happened where housewives who are at home most of the day are in certain of these housing estates catering to elderly and people who don't have kitchens or don't cook. There's a whole catering network that's happening as well. So there's a whole bunch of, and so before, so going back to the task of the architect, before I actually go into the task of rushing to design new typologies, there's just so much to actually catalog and analyze and so on. And actually I find my practice, going back to what you were saying, spending a lot more time on the research part of it rather than just jumping into often very naive kind of proposals that are very static, because right now in the last 2 months, very few people are eating out because of the current political situation. Everyone is cooking. Even those who hate cooking are trying not to go out. So, I mean, we're seeing a really interesting situation. But anyway.
Anything from the audience? 5 minutes. Right. Wow. Okay. Great. Then.
Sorry, that took long.
Great. No, actually, I wanted to follow up to what you said, Eunice. And I'm wondering. I mean, there are different ways. So, talking about the ways how we can think of facilitating togetherness beyond typologies and things like that, and really to think in broader terms. I mean, there are different understandings of what constitutes of being together and apart in different cultural contexts. And certainly I imagine that both in Singapore and Hong Kong, let's say the idea of togetherness and living in physical close proximity means something completely different than, let's say, experience of living in Detroit, for instance. So I was wondering, yeah, I mean, to what extent actually kind of architects with their tools and their possibilities to seek and work with those kind of different understandings of togetherness in our increasingly, complex society, and to which extent actually the actual design part could have any impact.
That's right. Well, it's funny to be in these two sort of, in a way, spots in the very developing region, because most of us find, and I speak to the group of the architects who are operating in Hong Kong and Singapore, finding ourselves working a lot in mainland China, in Vietnam, Cambodia, and where actually we are looking at high density, low rise, as well as the models we see. So in a way, the translation of these so-called high density models are very different when they hit the ground in different places. So for example, when we work on projects in Hangzhou and in the outskirts, we're mostly dealing with urban-rural situations. So then that requires us to ask a very different set of questions about density and also labor, because these are kind of, they're engaging in very urban activities, but in a very rural context, the countryside. And so the idea of boundaries and typologies become very interesting because it hits traditional craft. And so then that's another set of questions. So.
Right. So since we are into co-mode and we talk about different collectivities, I actually wanted to ask Ignacio, also looking at your work, so as there is this whole discussion going on in practice, but also of course in research and architecture about how do we understand collectivity and what are the different ways of articulating that within and beyond our architectural means. And of course, then there is a sharing economy that also is kind of, suggesting the idea that we should share things and be together. I was wondering, on the other hand, and also if once we are, especially in the European context, opening up to populations in transit, how at the same time we can think of, preserving the other kind of needs of maybe human nature, which is, a degree of individuality, intimacy, and even solitude in a way, even in our daily routines. Because it feels that nowadays, these things have become quite rare in our experience as we are being increasingly connected and bothered by different things. And then also, if our life is becoming more and more subjected to all kinds of collective assemblies, I wonder, are there also some things that are lost in this whole process in a way?
I imagine there will be things that are lost, but I wouldn't want to essentialize the pursuit for solitude or privacy or so as inherent to human nature, as you put it, because, I mean, as we know, those are historical constructions, and to accept that and to be sensitive to new sensitivities and acknowledge them through architecture, as I was saying before, I find more exciting than being nostalgic of what might be lost for certain kind of societies or cultures and such that, I mean, as we know, privacy is like a pretty recent construction, and some architecture historians had made an argument that architecture have played a role in its construction through the corridor and such. And of course, like I don't want to follow kind of the behavioral deterministic mode of thinking that would acknowledge, like that would establish a direct relationship between one and the other, but to provide new forms of being in common with recognition, as I've been saying, is very important rather than being nostalgic. And still, like, celebrating that those modes of sharing as the only way of being together. And in fact, the project I showed has in the kind of management protocols different ways of managing that whole system of apartments, from cooperatives to co-housing to condominiums. So like I imagine that different ways of managing housing could coexist and should coexist probably in the future.
Right.
But again, like I want to insist on what I said before. I'm not trying to invent necessarily those. I'm just, and that's why I started describing the neighborhood in which we are working in Northern Europe, in Hamburg, Wilhelmsburg, with certain kind of depth by acknowledging both the political forces that are transforming with what we like. What people feel about housing in this particular moment in relation to these populations in transit that you are saying, and particularly like that defense of the European mode of living is very dangerous. Actually, last week the new president of the European Commission has established the Ministry of the European Way of Living, to which she has assigned migration. I think that the response has been so violent to that idea that she's backing up a little bit, and that's going to change. But the project was to have a ministry, a European ministry for the European way of living, with migration included within it. So.
Wow. Wow. So, are we cut off?
Oh, there's a question.
Okay. Let's throw the box. No one is throwing it. Okay.
Hi, this works? Yeah. I wanted to, maybe as the last question, it's not a good one, but no, I wanted to bring the question of form into the equation, and especially with Ignacio finishing with saying that the relationship between the forms of architecture and forms of societies, right? And we've seen almost like two projects that are in, like, we could say both sides of the spectrum, maybe from a project that where both the living and the production and the working are embedded in the form. We see a project from Ignacio where let's say the image of the factory is very purposely used with large, let's say, open spaces with big spans, sawtooth roofs, and so on, right? And a perimetral, let's say, program around it, which kind of like brings the idea of merging both the factory and the living, right? The production and the reproduction. And then the other side of the spectrum, we see another way of responding to the same problem, which is through the work of the grid in the work of Mayo, right? Which is maybe the lack of image and creating an open framework for just things to happen, right? So, which is also a sort of, it's also form itself, right? The grid is a form in itself. So maybe we could, if any of you want to kind of like share some comments about that, how form kind of like you use form in a way of responding to new domesticities or new domestic structures. Yeah.
You want to go? You go. I mean, I just think that I do acknowledge the role of form and image as one of the mechanisms through which certain performances that are part of these modes of living together are activated. I think what is important is not to assume that they work univocally or in a kind of direct relationship with each other, but that they are mediated by technologies, like where are the pipes that allow for kitchens or bathrooms to be in certain ways, for certain protocols that are established in writing, and things like that. So I was thinking over lunch about this project I've been studying in New York, promoted by Broadway Housing Communities, the David Adge building in Sugar Hill. And in that project, the image plays a certain role, but a lot of the work that the building does depends on the location of certain shared spaces in certain positions, but also in the community that has decided to have neighbors control access to the building in the entrance. So it's a combination of spatial distributions, modes of management, the image and its relation to its context. So I do use aesthetics and kind of the imaginations that are triggered by certain aesthetics as one of the elements that are kind of participating in those modes of being together. But we also have to understand that in an increasingly kind of more globalized world, images mean very different things to different populations. So the idea that kind of the Rossian idea of typology as the collective kind of imagination that certain built forms trigger, it's really challenged by these kind of increasingly complex societies in which same built forms mean very different things. So I think that the collective that imagines anything is what it needs to be questioned. What collective is the one that is appealed by these collective imaginations.
I think on that note, we should conclude this panel, and we can keep searching for belonging and binding in the concluding remarks. Thank you.